Senator Alejo. Do we have any other authors here? Or Donald? How do you pronounce his last name again? Jackie? You know?
No.
Do you know how to pronounce his last name?
Italian.
Kacha. That was good. Kacha.
Shaji.
Okay.
And I still can't say Sachi.
So that's on consent.
Yeah,
Oh,
okay.
that's a good thing that's on consent.
Funny lady. So we've got two items on consent. File item 3, file item 4, and file item 8.
Yes, sir.
We just need one more member for a quorum I can do consent calendar. Hello, doctor.
Hey, how are you, my friend?
Good, sir. It wouldn't be really bad if, since no authors have showed up, I just adjourned the meeting, would it? Here we go. We got a quorum. Call the meeting to order. Secretary, call the roll.
Hertzberg.
Here.
Hertzberg present. Wynn.
Here.
Wynn present. Bell. Hernandez. Hernandez present. Lara. Morlock. No.
Morlock not present?
Morlock's not present, but he's physically here.
Present. Pavley. You have a quorum.
We have a quorum. We have two items on consent, members. File item number 4, AB 341, as well as file item number 8, AB 823. Can I entertain a motion from somebody? Dr. Hernandez moves the consent calendar. Secretary, call the roll.
Hertzberg.
Aye.
Hertzberg, aye. Wynn. Wynn, aye. Bell. Hernandez. Hernandez, aye. Lara. Morlock. Morlock, aye. Pavley. 4-0.
4-0. We'll keep that open for the absent members. Do we have any members here? Brown, Alejo, O'Donnell, Mullen, Gordon, Wood. A motion to adjourn. We don't need a second. Come on, guys. We got to have somebody coming. Don't the assembly watch this TV thing? Is there somebody in one of these offices? Oh, in Levine's office. All those in Assemblymember Levine's office, please, who was a measure before this committee. I will adjourn in 5 minutes, by the way. Yeah, that's good. I know. You were so good. When I was in the Assembly, I never had the guts to be late to a Senate meeting. Here we go. You got lucky. We're about to adjourn, Mr. Chairman. File item number 2, AB 2, Assemblymember Alejo, Community Revitalization Investment Authority.
Thank you, Mr.
Chairman.
Chairman and members, I don't know if the microphone's on.
Is it on?
It is?
You hear it?
Very good. Before I begin, I would like to accept the technical amendments as proposed by the committee and accept them as author's amendments. And I would also like to thank the committee staff for their hard work on this bill for the now going on 3 years. I have before you AB 2, which will allow certain blighted areas of California to create a new entity called the Community Revitalization Investment Authority, or CREA, to work towards tackling issues facing our state's most disadvantaged communities. In 2011, the state dissolved its redevelopment agencies, driven primarily by the cost of redevelopment to the state's general fund. But the needs of struggling communities did not go away. AB 2 will work to changes by investing property tax increment of consenting local agencies other than schools to improve our local communities. This will grow jobs, reduce crime, repair deteriorating and inadequate infrastructure, clean up brownfield sites, and promote affordable housing. The bill requires 25% of the funds to also be set aside for affordable housing and will help rebuild impoverished communities across the state. If we don't fix our existing neighborhoods, then cities will sprawl outward, worsening costly problems like traffic and greenhouse gas emissions. And I have worked tirelessly on this concept for the last 3 years, and although the governor did not sign AB 2280 last year, I'm optimistic that he will sign AB 2 this year, given the technical changes we have made to address his office's concerns. This bill has received bipartisan support throughout the Assembly, and this year we have made the bill a Latino caucus priority bill as well. As it offers the benefits to our most disadvantaged communities, I respectfully ask for an aye vote, and I have some folks to speak in support of this bill, Mr. Chairman.
Those in support?
Mr. Chairman, members, Dan Carrick on behalf of the League of California Cities in support. Appreciate Mr. Alejo's work on this over the last 3 or 4 years. While there was a bill last year, EIFD, that was passed, it does provide some additional options for local agencies. Our local communities still believe that there's a role and an important role for this bill, at least having choices on the shelf. And so this is something that we think can help our communities, especially the poorer areas of our communities, do economic development, rebuild those areas, and we urge your support. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, members, David Jones on behalf of the cities of Glendale, Sacramento, and Santa Rosa. As mentioned by the League, the need is still very great for a replacement tool. We have very, very significant problems of economic development. We're the job creators of the state. So we would really urge a passage of AB 2 and would ask for an aye vote.
Greg DeGere with the ARC and United Cerebral Palsy California Collaboration, a coalition of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families, friends, and service providers. People with developmental disabilities overwhelmingly, or adults with developmental disabilities, overwhelmingly have poverty-level incomes and have probably we think, the biggest need of any community in the state for affordable housing. That's why we support this bill.
Mr. Chairman, committee members, Silvio Ferrari with the California Building Industry Association, very strong support.
Mr. Chair, members, Jeremy Mers on behalf of the California Chamber of Commerce, also in strong support.
Christina Lockey with the California Special Districts Association in support.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Keith Dunn here on behalf of the California Apartment Association, also in support.
Yolanda Benson with the California Asian Pacific Chamber of Commerce. There really is nothing that helps local areas anymore to help targeted areas in places with high unemployment. This gives local communities a tool, and we definitely support the bill.
Good morning, Erica Arriaga with the League of California Cities Latino Caucus, the City of Watsonville, the City of Salinas, City of Seaside, Monterey County, Tampsey, and Fora in support.
Thank you so much. Those in opposition? Mr. Minority Leader.
Mr. Chairman, members, Bob Naylor, representing Fuelstead and Company, and also this morning the California Alliance to Protect Private Property Rights. We object to the bill because it brings back eminent domain power for local agencies. 10 years ago, the U.S. Supreme Court in Kelo versus New London, Connecticut, by a 5-4 decision, said that it was constitutional to transfer, to seize property by eminent domain and transfer it to private developers for development purposes. But we still don't think it's right, for example, to take a family-owned business, likely in a minority community, force it to close, board it up, bulldoze it, and then wait for a developer to come along after the unpredicted next recession. That is our fundamental disagreement with the bill, but this committee has governance and finance, and I want to stress the finance area as well as the governance area. The legislative analyst, when he studied redevelopment, when the governor made his proposal in 2011, said that there's no evidence that redevelopment creates net new jobs. There are 3 things I would like the committee to consider. Number 1, last year, Senator Bell passed and the governor signed SB 628. That is it's the Enhanced Infrastructure Financing District legislation that includes a housing component. That did not include eminent domain, and it's exciting the economic development community. It was partially sponsored by the chair's former organization, California Forward, and the committee analysis justly raises the question, shouldn't we let that measure work before we load on yet another tool? Secondly, eminent domain is a hit on the state finances, and this is how that works. It allows these agencies to take property off the rolls. When you take property off the rolls, you lose not only the city's property tax, you lose the school's property tax. The state has to backfill that property tax. There's nothing in eminent domain that prevents a city from taking a profitable hotel over and then leasing it back to the former owner of the hotel for a percentage of the gross receipts. The property is off the rolls. The schools lose, the state loses, the city gains. So keep that in mind. And finally, I wonder if the state should be creating a carrot for cities to mortgage their future tax increment. Cities like the city of Los Angeles that can't afford to fix the sidewalks and are asking homeowners to take over that responsibility are facing huge increases in pension costs. And this bill, by dangling eminent domain in front of the cities, makes it easy for them to mortgage the future tax increment with a 40-year bond with no vote of the people at a time when cities are under increasing pressure. So for all of those reasons, we think it's a bad idea to pass a bill with eminent domain power, and we've urged the author now for 3 years to take that part out. Thank you.
Before you go, Mr. Neal, I got some questions. Any others in opposition? Any others in opposition? Yeah, just real quickly, I think you may have answered it in terms of having a discussion with the author with respect to the eminent domain piece. Mr. Leo, you believe that that's a critical element of making this thing work?
Well, first of all, Mr. Chairman, I think the arguments have been the same over the last 3 years, simply from our point of view, unfounded, because this tool, for two things. One, it's geared to help the most disadvantaged communities, those communities that are struggling the most. It stays true to the original intent of redevelopment law, which is to help those communities who have high crime, high poverty, high unemployment. This sticks true to that original ideal. Second, has the most accountability measures included in this provision to address a lot of the concerns that existed from the former redevelopment agency. And that's why there is an openness to this concept from the governor's office, because we included multiple measures, multiple hearings to create a plan just to create this entity called a CREA, annual reports to the community of how they're meeting the community goals. And the most powerful measure is that if there were to be abuse or somebody were to misuse any elements of this new tool, the public has the right to the referendum halt all future activities if this entity created at the local level is not meeting community goals, if they're abusing any power. And because of that, the way we drafted this law with a lot of community input, a lot of the stakeholders that you heard speak earlier try to address a lot of the concerns. This model, this particular version of this bill has the most accountability measure to address or prevent any abuse of the elements provided in the.
Before you go, I want to ask a couple of questions. I know Senator Pavley will be up next, but just real quickly on this. I mean, you talk about the eminent domain law. Is it a situation where you're just, Mr. Naylor, objecting to the notion of eminent domain, or is there anything in difference with respect to how the stare decisis? We've seen eminent domain law work in the state for a long time. There's generally there's a political movement that says we don't like eminent domain, but the construct of the law is pretty protective. There's a huge amount of case authority in order to determine the public purpose, how it works, how the bidding process works. Is there anything in this measure that is different than what the current law is, or does it just simply allow the current law to be applied with respect to the proposed redevelopment law that Mr. Leo talked about?
There's nothing different in this. What we object to is the transfer of private property to private developers. Obviously, eminent domain for infrastructure purposes, schools, courthouses, nobody objects to that, and we don't object to that. But
yeah, but the notion behind the redevelopment concept in the law is that it does serve a public purpose. The argument the governor makes, I think, is fair, is the sense that, look, you're out there, you want to help one community, you're going to give them the increment, but then on the flip side, when the county's trying to use the money to pay for welfare or the social services, they're deprived of that money. And so that money gets drained, and it's become a tool. And it's been something that the governor, and I generally agree with him, has been out of balance.
And that applies to the tax increment.
Right.
And this bill doesn't have that former flaw in the tax increment. But when you take the property off the tax rolls, the schools and the county are deprived of the property tax revenues from the property.
Two more quick questions. One is, why don't you think that the enhanced infrastructure financial district that Senator Bell put together works if it includes housing? It seems a pretty thoughtful thing. You see in Los Angeles, the LA River folks all around the state, there's a lot of folks that are trying to work in that field. I have questions about it, quite frankly, because I talk to a lot of my people in the finance world, in my old finance world, but why do you need to clearly you've been working this bill for a long time, and it's been held up in committees, the governor's vetoed it. I'm going to ask you a question about that, my last question, but why can't Senator Bell's measure work to solve the underlying public policy challenges that you talk about?
Well, first of all, from the very beginning, as we advocated for this bill going back 3 years, it was always as a concept as you want to have multiple tools and toolbox for local communities to use. So this is one of hopefully several that cities have to use. The IFDs may work for some cities in other areas. And
provide an example of where you think an enhanced IFD as envisioned by Senator Bell's measure, would not work, and where the proposed measure that you have would work. You have an idea?
Well, from what I understand, for a lot of communities, it's much more difficult to put an IFD before their community and have it approved by a 55% vote and have that approved in advance to creating this tool to be utilized by that community. This doesn't require a 55% vote threshold, which politically for many communities, struggling communities, is hard to accomplish. That's why since its creation, you haven't seen a lot of cities jump up and try to put a ballot creating an IFD with a 55% threshold. So it creates a different process. An entity, a county or city, you have 3 public members, 2 public members, 3 of the governmental body, but certainly a strong sense of accountability measures that are included to address, to ensure that these new entities are meeting the goals of the public.
A last question before I go to Senator Pavley and Senator Morlock. And that is, last year the governor said, I look forward to working with the author to craft an appropriate legislative solution. What have you done differently in this measure, and have you communicated with the governor to determine if this, in his judgment, is an appropriate legislative solution? Are we just wasting our time to stick it in his nose again? Which is not a bad thing, I'm not suggesting, but I just want to know why.
No, Mr. Chairman, we have been in close contact with the governor's office, with all his staff on this bill. Last year, there was positive feedback on the bill. What was really different from...
vetoed it. Positive.
Yeah, no, but
Let's make a change. What did you do?
That's what I'm getting to, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Last year's version, AB 2280, the main technical change that was needed was that the governor's office didn't want this version to go refer back to old redevelopment law, the redevelopment statute. Right. So we addressed that by creating a new statute, a new code section that puts it entirely in a different code section, and it's not referring back to a redevelopment law that's currently under a lot of litigation. Nice. And with that technical change, that's what added many more pages to this version of the bill, but that was to address the governor's concern, and I think we've thoroughly done that.
Good answer. Senator Pavley, anything further? I'll get him now.
No, I think that was my main question. Well, how does this perform differently? And as a former local government official, I view eminent domain used appropriately as an essential tool, hopefully never to be used. We had a case in Agora Hills where, you had trying to put in a street to open up a commercial area in a sort of a relatively depressed area of the city because of lack of infrastructure. We qualified for redevelopment because there was inadequate infrastructure. And you had 7 property owners, 6 negotiate with you, and the other one purposely holds out.
Right.
In order to either leverage a higher price, but we had to unfortunately go through eminent domain as a last resort. That's right. Because too much was online and the other property owners were all at the table. And so I just wanted to applaud Assemblymember Oleo. Maybe the 3rd time's a charm, but he knows this issue.
He knows this stuff. It's very impressive.
So appreciate that.
Thank you. Excellent job.
And if you need a motion later on, I'd be glad to move the bill.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Morlock and then Senator Hernandez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In 2012, I was chairman of the Board of Supervisors of Orange County when redevelopment agencies were terminated. So we had to scramble like immediately to get successor agencies put together. And so I'm just kind of curious if you have some answers to some of the issues we've dealt with. One was that we had a very difficult time with the Department of Finance, and a lot of our cities were suing over properties that were in controversy. And I'm just curious, do you have any status of the lawsuits? Are they resolved, or are they still ongoing?
And maybe the League of Cities could help answer that question, but from my understanding is many of these, when redevelopment was dissolved, where there was going to be disputes, there was an effort by the legislature to create like a mediation process to resolve disputes with the Department of Finance and a lot of communities. Unfortunately, that mediation kind of process wasn't created. Instead, they knew that some of these cities would have to resolve these disputes in court. Some of those have gone forward, and now they're subject to some of the issues in the budget this year. Some are subject to different pieces of legislation that have moved forward. Some have resolved and wound down their agencies in a favorable manner. Others have had disputes. One being one of the cities that I represent, there was a legal dispute about certain types of loans that get reimbursed. Are those subject to get repaid back or not? And fortunately for my city, it got resolved in their favor. So there's a lot of different legal issues that have gone on before the court. Some of those cities have lost, and there have been others who have prevailed in court. But maybe the League of Cities could give a more thorough update.
Senator, yeah, there's obviously there's been redevelopment was a huge tool. There were 385 agencies, and it was a $6 billion a year program. And sort of cutting that off at one point, there were lots of issues that had to be worked through. I think progress has been made. You can see there's been, I think, well over 300 findings of completion, which is one by the Department of Finances, which one aspect of a part of the dissolution process. From a city standpoint, we realize the old tool that's been discussed a little bit, that's gone. Cities are really looking forward to move forward. We'd like to get the redevelopment disputes from the past behind us and be able to move forward. That's why having new tools that people can look at going forward is what we're looking at. I'd be happy to talk to you more about this whole issue of dissolution, and there's some pending proposals, but this isn't the place to lobby you on that, but I'd be happy to talk to you about that.
I have plenty of time, so come on by.
Thank you.
I am just curious, could you give me an example, Assemblyman, on why you need a redevelopment agency? Why can't you just use a free market approach and just, if you have an area that you're concerned about, just make honest offers? Right? I know Senator Pavley talked about a holdout, but could you give me an example?
Yeah, well, first of all, there used to be several tools that were aimed to help the most disadvantaged communities. One was enterprise zones, and there was reforms towards that, and whether the changes make it a better tool is in question. But certainly redevelopment was one of the most important because it had the 75% set aside for economic development, and it was like the only tool that many cities had if they wanted to clean up a brownfield site and put it back to good economic and public use. That tool is gone. If a disadvantaged community is competing with many other options that companies have to go to, well, redevelopment was a tool that could be able to match to attract employers or to help companies already there expand and create new jobs. The other really important part was actually, it was 80% set aside. It was 20% set aside for affordable housing. That was the only tool that many communities had to create workforce housing for their local constituents, and then that tool was completely gone, and that's why there's several bills this year to bring back some type of affordable housing mechanism for cities to use. So in many ways, it has really hurt the cities who have the greatest need to have tools to attract economic development and to address affordable housing needs in their own respective communities.
And as a supervisor of a county that watched a couple cities abuse RDAs, one in my district and one in Senator Wynn's district, where they almost became 100% RDA, and once they were terminated, had to lay off a significant number of employees because it was sort of a budget tool. So we've certainly seen a lot of abuse. And in my own city, removing medical offices to put in a shopping center, which was a total failure. We call it Triangle Square. It's finally, after 26 or 7 years, finally starting to turn a profit. So I've just seen a lot of these things where I can get really nervous. So with Senate Bill 628 that Senator Bell had passed just last year, have we given that enough time? I mean, 1 year, it seems like we should wait a little bit and let Senator Bell's bill kind of display itself before we pursue a private-to-private transaction. I'm very nervous about that.
Well, first of all, back in 2011, when we were discussing the dissolution and redevelopment, my argument from the very beginning was let's address the reforms where there's abuses, and let's make it a better tool so that communities are not doing those examples of abuse. That was always my call, and I've been consistent for the last 4 or 5 years on that. But I think in this bill, we've tried to address that. That originally in the bill, we had a tool of accountability that after 10 years of activity, if there was abuse, a referendum could take place after 10 full years of activity. The governor didn't want that. He wanted us to push that referendum ability by the public to the very beginning, so that at any point, if this new CREA entity is abusing it, if they're abusing eminent domain or not fulfilling the needs as they expressed in their plan to their local communities, the community could halt any activity. That's the most effective tool to completely halt their future activity. It's the most effective tool to ensure that that does not take place. And going back to my good friend Senator Bell's bill, like I said, this always was not intended to compete with it, but provide additional tools for communities to use. And like I said, there will be examples communities use IFD and it'll work well, but there's many communities that politically don't have that option to put it before the voters and get the 55% needed. Those communities are then left with no option, and this is trying to give that additional tool to those communities where an IFD will not work for that local community.
Thank you, Assemblyman Mr. Naylor.
Madam Chairman, I respond on the protest mechanism. It exists at the beginning, so that if a protest is brought at the beginning of the process, an election can be forced. An election is not automatic. And then it exists 10 years later. It is little solace for a property owner whose property has been taken by eminent domain in the meantime to have the right to protest and dissolve the agency at the 10-year period. So we don't think that's an adequate remedy.
Senator Hernandez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, quite a few of my cities were pretty upset when redevelopment was taken away. And on the flip side, I also understand and know that there have been question I have, so the first question I have is with regard to the authority, creating the authority. And that would be, I'm assuming, the responsibility of the local city government or local authority, is that correct? And that creating that authority, would that be amongst themselves, say council members that would create that authority themselves?
Dan Carrick explained.
Well, there's a more enhanced public process that Assemblymember Alejo talked about as sort of a series of public hearings, things like that. One of the key differences, we made a number of changes to the law that address the accountability issue. The first thing is, under the old RDA law, you had the city council would just sort of sit as the redevelopment agency. One way we got accountability is we have 2 people on the board have to be from the affected area. In other words, so they're trying to make sure that those affected are much more connected to those that are in charge.
So these would be citizens at large then?
Yes, from the affected area.
The affected area. Okay, so the concern I had with the prior mechanism is, the ability for the public to see what was going on. I'm assuming they'd have to follow the Brown Act and Open Meetings Acts, et cetera. Whereas some of the, my understanding, some of the previous authorities could be in closed session, they can make decisions. So all of this would be in public domain then?
Yes, sir. All the Brown Act and Public Records Act and all that are cross-referenced in the bill. But there are additional audits and other efforts to ensure transparency, annual audits and other things like that we want this tool to be successful as well. So it'll be successful to the extent it's used and you're not reading things in the paper about problems. We want that as well. And so we've added the additional accountability provisions to try to get there.
So tell me a little bit about the tax increment. Is it similar to the former redevelopment where it would be the new developed property and there would be the difference in the tax increment that would go to the authority and then either the cities, the counties, or the schools would get the original amount? Would it work the same way or is it a little different?
It's the new paradigm for tax increment, as was in Senator Bell's bill and other bills, is that if you're a city and you're forming one of these areas, you start with your own growth on your own share of tax increment. If the county's going to be affected, it's only with their consent. If a special district is going to be affected, it's only with their consent. And the school share, which obviously has Prop 98 impacts, is walled off.
So, I mean, the other question I have is with regard to the disadvantaged communities, and I couldn't agree more, especially when you're looking at very wealthy communities. I think there was a comment made that entire areas are under redevelopment. And then I'll have one final question and concern about the eminent domain portion. But in your bill, does it delineate what a disadvantaged community is with regard to allowing that entity to occur, and where do you draw the line, and how am I guaranteed that it's going to help disadvantaged communities?
The first thing it does, it by definition, it tracks some of the definitions the state is using for disadvantaged communities. In other words, these are areas where the census tracts, the households have below 80% of median income. So it tracks it by income. And as Assemblyman Vallejo touched on, there are some other evidence of whether physical deterioration of the area as well as economic deterioration, whether higher rates of unemployment and/or crime in the area. So there's an effort to make sure that if you have a deteriorated area that is lower income, this is the tool that you have on the shelf you might be able to use. If you want to do something else in terms of something in a higher income area, whatever, then you would use, I'm assuming, Mr. Bell's tool or something else. But we want to make sure the tool stays true to the original purposes of redevelopment.
And final question with regard to eminent domain. I mean, I believe that it's a tool that's necessary, but I guess one of the concerns that I would have would be that it would be exclusive for public purposes. I guess the concern I would have is if you invoke eminent domain for a private purpose. I mean, do you have any consideration to eliminate that portion at least, or is it going to be for any purposes?
The use of the tool for eminent domain would be completely consistent with the original uses of authority of redevelopment, so there's no proposed change there. What is different is the additional accountability mechanisms that have been attached to it. One, the potential for a vote at the very beginning to do whether or not to even do the project at all. Two, if you have a board, you got two people from the affected area that are part of it. And the kicker, Mr. Naylor has questioned the effectiveness, but I mean, if you're on a board and you know that the residents of the area can shut you down if they're not happy with what you're doing, that's some accountability. And that was never the case before with the prior tool. And the prior tool, once you set up the agency, you were pretty much in business for 40 years. Now, you've got to look ahead and you better keep the community happy and they better feel like you're on track with what you said, or otherwise they're going to shut you down. So we think it's a lot more accountability than the prior tool.
You know, at the same point, though, if a house is taken away or a piece of property is taken away, you know, after it's done, it's kind of hard to come back and get recourse at a later time, so.
On the House issue, the witness issue, I mentioned the Kelo case. The voters of California did pass, I believe it was Prop 99, that directly addressed the Kelo case and made it a lot harder to take a residence going forward, and it's in the Constitution.